Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. The semi-autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq went to the ballot box on Monday to decide whether the Kurdistan region will secede from Iraq to become an independent state.
The semi-autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq went to the ballot box on Monday to vote in a historic and controversial referendum to decide whether Kurdistan, as a region of Iraq, will split from Baghdad to form an independent state. The referendum took place amid rising tensions and international opposition. Polls opened at 5 a.m. in the region, including the disputed areas between the northern city of Erbil and the capital Baghdad, as well as the oil-rich province of Kirkuk, which is ethnically mixed. Voting was open to 5.2 million Kurds and non-Kurds registered as residents in the Kurdish-controlled areas. The central government in Baghdad, which strongly opposes the referendum, assumed control of the region's international border posts and airports a day before the vote. The non-Kurdish populations in disputed areas also showed opposition to the referendum, with the local ethnic Arab and Turkmen communities in Kirkuk calling for a boycott of the vote. According to the Electoral Commission, turnout was estimated at around 72%. Of the 3.3 million Kurds and non-Kurds who cast their votes, 92% supported secession. Celebrations took place as the polls closed in the regional capital Erbil, in the disputed and ethnically mixed city of Kirkuk. A curfew was imposed on Monday night following fears of unrest. Kurds are the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East and have never founded a permanent nation state. They are estimated to make up 15 to 20% of the Iraqi populations and have faced decades of repression before acquiring autonomy in 1991.
Our guest in the studio tonight is Aydın Selcen, who is Turkey's first consul general in Erbil, northern Iraq. And joining us from Süleymaniye, northern Iraq, is Barın Kayaoğlu, who is an assistant professor of history at the American University of Iraq and also a writer for the Al Monitor website. Welcome, Mr. Selcen.
Good evening.
Welcome, Mr. Kayaoğlu.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
So, Mr. Selcen, let's start talking with you. As you know, this referendum happened despite numerous forms of discouragement and resistance from different governments, including not only Turkey, but also the central government in Baghdad and also most of the governments in the West. So as someone who knows Masoud Barzani very well, how do you think the KRG, the Kurdish regional government, succeeded in getting to this point and going on with this referendum, despite all odds?
Well, as I wrote about this issue on Duvar website in my column as well, this was, to my mind, a historical opportunity for Mr. Barzani. He is 71 years old, and he had to remain to the legacy of his family, first of all. And this was the only way for him personally, and also for KDP as a Kurdish political movement, to succeed in having achieved their goal. This is one thing, but is not the only reason and the only motivation. The thing is, this historic moment of achieving independence arrived first after the first Gulf War in 91-92. That went through as the two factions, PUK and KDP, battled each other and in heavy losses reaching up to 3,000 people on both sides combined. Then the second historic moment, again to my mind, arrived in 2004 when Iraq, after the second Gulf War, wrote its own constitution, turning Iraq into a federation. That was accepted in 2005 in a referendum. And again, the Kurds, or the Kurdistan region, so to speak, succeeded in running a sort of an opinion poll and again reached the same results, over 90% of the inhabitants of the then region, because that region's frontiers were different than today's frontiers, post-ISIS frontiers, let's say. And this moment now, in 2017, again, is the right moment from the lens of Mr. Barzani. Why? Because Baghdad is busy in dealing with Islamic State. So they are not strong enough in opposing the Kurdistan region, and they will be most definitely strong enough in the coming decade. And then it seemed to me also that there was tacit approval from either both Iran and Turkey, or at least from Ankara. If you look at the photographs with Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, the Turkish foreign minister, and Mr. President Barzani in late August, when the foreign minister visited Erbil, you see both sides are on all smiles. So the rhetoric hardened in the last weeks, maybe, and then it turned into a really belligerent approach right after the referendum. So that sort of, to my mind, misled as the intentions of Ankara are concerned for Mr. Barzani. In any case, now with a participation rate of over 70% and with a yes vote of over 90%, Erbil's or Iraqi Kurdistan region's hand is much stronger in dealing with Baghdad, and they time and again declare that they are not going to follow through with a formal declaration of independence, but they will prefer to negotiate with Baghdad. So this is a success still for Erbil, but these coming weeks are very precarious, so to speak. We have to watch very closely whether the conflict will reach a military confrontation stage.
And let's turn to Mr. Kayaoğlu now. As you're joining us from Süleymaniye in northern Iraq, Mr. Kayaoğlu, let me start by asking you how the atmosphere currently is over there after the referendum. And I'd like to ask you, actually, how are the results being received by the local population over there at the moment?
Süleymaniye was somewhat skeptical, relatively skeptical, compared to the rest of Iraqi Kurdistan, to the referendum. In the run-up to the referendum, 2 days before the referendum, there was talk that the PUK would withdraw from the referendum. Then they didn't. There was a Facebook post by the PUK's chairman, Jalal Talabani, by the son of the PUK president, Jalal Talabani, Pavel Talabani, who first posted a Facebook note saying that, PUK is now against it. Then he erased it, then posted something similar, saying that it was a mistake, but the PUK, instead of doing the referendum, is open to the idea of sitting down with Baghdad and negotiating directly with Baghdad. As you may know, the Goran movement, the movement for change, which actually emerged from within the ranks of the PUK, itself had been somewhat opposed to the referendum. So as far as Süleymaniye is concerned, there was a certain level of skepticism, maybe some relative distance to the idea of a referendum, not with the notion of Kurdish independence. Let me remind our viewers, people were wholeheartedly supportive of the idea of Kurdistan gaining independence. In fact, before and during the Ba'ath regime in Iraq, Soleimani was actually the center of Kurdish nationalist aspirations in Iraq for many decades. What many people here were opposed were the timing and the way that the referendum was handled. Many people were skeptical that President Masoud Barzani, the president of Iraqi Kurdistan, was using this as a political ploy to hedge his base of support, possibly expand it to different parts of Iraqi Kurdistan. But in the aftermath of the vote, there was some there was some excitement, and many people seemed elated by the prospects of their land finally becoming an independent country, and this prospect of Iraqi Kurdistan becoming independent. But then toward later in the week that started to fade away until Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan started speaking out not only strongly against the referendum and its following results, but also started using language that the people here find the people here find extremely offensive. I'm referring to his speech at the National Police Academy 2 days ago, where Erdogan talked about how Iraqi Kurdistan depends on Turkish logistics, how if Turkey were to close its borders, that Iraqi Kurdistan would starve in a matter of months, how they need Turkey for basically all their trade. Now here's the thing, much of this is true, but using language that people take in a very personal fashion, moving this dispute from outside the realms of diplomacy into almost what Iraqi Kurds see as a personal attack, has actually started to steal many people's resolve for supporting Iraqi Kurdistan's independence. Many people who were either sitting on the fence or who were somewhat indifferent to what is going on have now begun to not only speak for independence, but much to President Erdogan's, I'm sure that was not his intention, but many people have actually started to rally around their political leaders, to rally around President Barzani. He has earned a lot of respect for not listening to the international community and pushing the referendum through. And so Turkey's rhetoric is currently being viewed as quite offensive. Much of the goodwill that Turkey had built in Iraqi Kurdistan in the last 7-8 years, once Turkey's own Kurdish opening started, I can say has either completely evaporated or is about to evaporate, is about to go away for the time being.
Mr. Kayaoğlu, are there any visible, observable tensions between the different ethnic groups both in Süleymaniye and northern Iraq at the moment after the referendum? Obviously, I'm talking about the Turkmens, the Arabs, and the Kurds.
There is some tension. I cannot lie if I say there isn't, but much of it is on a personal basis. Many ethnic Arabs or ethnic Turkmens who live in Iraqi Kurdistan, when you talk to them, they say, I haven't experienced anything, they say, but I'm uneasy about being here right now because tensions are high and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. While Iraqi Kurds, by and large, are respectful people, you know, they make a point of treating others, both people, their own people and strangers, with respect and dignity, quite friendly people, much like people in different parts of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Balkan area. But if there is a shooting war, people's position could change. Unfortunately, war brings out the worst in people, and many non-Kurds here have expressed some degree of concern, even though the Kurdistan regional government has made it explicitly clear that even if the KRG becomes independent, that they will not in any way discriminate against non-Kurds, nor will they tolerate anyone discriminating against or mistreating non-Kurds.
So, putting aside the bleak scenarios, is there hope for Iraq as a whole at the moment? How do you evaluate the current political climate inside Iraq?
I'm by nature an optimistic person, so my answer is there's always hope. And when I talk to my Iraqi friends, of course, I always give the example of, Iraq and Baghdad survived the Mongol invasion 800 years ago. and it rose from the ashes of that. So there's always a better time ahead. I do believe that. Certain things are going still in a positive direction. Neither side has completely threatened to explicitly use force against the other. In fact, both the language coming out of Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, and Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, from Iraqi leaders, Iraqi Kurdish leaders, has been rather measured. As for whether there's a hope for Iraq in the near future, I would say yes. Currently, the former deputy prime minister of Iraq, and who also served as the prime minister of Iraqi Kurdistan, Dr. Barham Saleh, has initiated a new political movement, Coalition for Democracy and Justice, and he's bringing together at the initial stages various different parties from throughout Iraqi Kurdistan as a sort of protest and reform movement to change the political status quo, to break the political logjam of Iraqi Kurdistan. And it is very clear that Dr. Barham, whom I should also mention that he's the founder of the American University of Iraq Soleimani, where I work, and so I do have a very positive view of him personally, so I should be honest and clear about that to your viewers. But so far, Dr. Barham has made has given a much more positive message to the people of Kurdistan and Iraq, and it's something of a change from what people have heard in the last couple of years. Whether he can succeed remains to be seen, but I would say that movements such as this idea of changing the political status quo, breaking the political status quo, and pulling Kurdistan and Iraq forward, there is some movement in that front. But of course, Iraqi Kurdistan, the KRG, is scheduled to have parliamentary and presidential elections on 1 November. Iraq is supposed to have its federal elections, parliamentary elections, in the spring. Whether movements such as that of Dr. Barham could succeed remains to be seen. I personally have witnessed that he has a lot of support here in the Soleimani area. He's treated as something of a celebrity. Whether that popularity could be replicated elsewhere in Kurdistan, elsewhere in Iraq, with him building political bridges and alliances with other Iraqi factions, we shall see.
So let's now hear more about the reactions that came to this referendum from different governments, and then we can be back in the studio to continue our conversation with Mr. Selcen and Mr. Kayaoğlu.
The Iraqi Kurdistan independence referendum, held on Monday, has drawn reaction from many countries. Besides harsh criticisms from Turkey, Iran and Iraq, the US, Russia and UN also expressed their concerns about the potentially destabilizing effects of the referendum. Just hours after polls closed on September 25th, the Iraqi Defense Ministry announced the launch of large-scale joint military exercises with the Turkish armed forces. The rhetoric from both Ankara and Baghdad on Tuesday raised up pressure on the Kurdish region following the referendum vote a day earlier. In a speech in Ankara on Tuesday, President Erdogan warned that Turkey blocks Kurdish tracks from crossing the border, while adding that all options, including economic and military sanctions, were on the table. This referendum decision, which has been taken without any consultation, is treachery, Erdogan said, threatening again to cut off the pipeline that carries oil from northern Iraq to the outside world. Erdogan also said the separatist referendum was unacceptable and vowed that economic, trade and security countermeasures would be taken. We are taking and will continue to take all necessary steps on the political, economic, trade and security fronts. The armed forces did not take necessary steps in Silopi for no reason. There will be no compromise, he said, referring to the military exercise currently in progress on Turkey's Iraqi border. On the other hand, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu vowed that Turkey would intervene militarily if the Turkmen population in Iraq, especially in Kirkuk, is targeted. In response to harsh criticisms made by Ankara, KRG Prime Minister Nachivan Barzani, however, argued that Erbil has never been a threat to Turkey and will remain not a threat. We do not and will not threaten Turkey's national security. Neither will we intervene in Turkish affairs, not today and not in the future. We want to be a good neighbor, Barzani said. Meanwhile, Iraqi lawmakers demanded that government troops be deployed to areas disputed with Kurds. Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi also said that his government would not halt talks about the results of Monday's secession vote. Abadi said that those who were responsible for the unconstitutional referendum would be duly punished. Separately on Wednesday, 210 out of 290 lawmakers in the Iranian parliament issued a statement supporting the Baghdad government. The MPs further called on the Iranian government to cooperate with Baghdad and halt the Zionist adventurism in Iraq. On the other hand, Washington and Moscow also reacted to the referendum. The White House has warned that a Kurdish move toward independence could set off ethnic conflict and that it could fracture Iraq and undermine the American-led coalition against the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. We hope for a unified Iraq to annihilate ISIS and certainly a unified Iraq to push back on Iran, the White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders said Monday. On Wednesday, the Russian Foreign Ministry reiterated the country's support for coexistence within a single Iraqi state. On Tuesday, in New York, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres also said he was concerned about the potentially destabilizing effects of the referendum. After all, Turkey, Iran and Iraq may hold a trilateral meeting to discuss the Iraqi Kurdish independence referendum, Turkey's Prime Minister Binali Yildirim said on Thursday.
Welcome back, Mr. Kayaoğlu. Let's start with you now. Perhaps the number one argument against this referendum by most governments, including Turkey and the Western governments, was that it would have destabilizing effects on the region and that it could perhaps initiate brand new armed conflicts. It may be too early to ask this to you, but does it look like, in your opinion, that a new war is in the cards?
I hope not, because I'm definitely on the wrong side of the border for that. But I also don't think it's likely, or that it's probable at this stage for several reasons. So far, we haven't actually seen the neighboring governments, especially Turkey and Iran, and the Iraqi federal government in Baghdad doing the worst. So far, Iraq's response has been. Has come in an expected fashion. It has been measured. Whether it's blocking off certain parts of Kirkuk province and putting some distance between themselves and the Peshmerga in Kirkuk, whether it's closing the international airports in Erbil and Suleimani to international flights. These have been measured responses, I would say. So far, we have also seen not much military movement by direct movement that is directly targeting the KRG, the Iraqi Kurdistan government. We have seen a Turkish military exercise in Silopi, at the point where Turkey's borders with Syria and Iraq meet. And in fact, it's important to note that Iraqi troops have actually started holding joint exercises with the Turkish military in that area, just basically a few kilometers from Iraq's border crossing into Turkey, which, by the way, is controlled by the KRG. Iran's response has also been measured so far. Iran has only stopped fuel shipments, and it has, to a lesser degree, shelled the Kurdish militant group Pejak's bases in the Kandil mountain ranges in Iraqi Kurdistan. But except for that, Iran's response too has been measured. What I am actually worried about in terms of this problem escalating is for a possible a black swan event, an unforeseen event, possibly a catastrophic terrorist attack killing scores of people, occurring at a very sensitive location, either within Baghdad or somewhere in Kirkuk or Erbil or in Mosul or in one of the other disputed areas between the KRG and the federal government of Iraq, and then that leading to a train of events that would be extremely hard to control. In terms of this crisis escalating into an actual armed conflict, I don't expect it, but I am certainly not discounting it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask a version of the same question to you, Mr. Selcen. As you know, as I've also mentioned in my previous question, the famous phrase, potentially destabilizing effect, was cited several times in both the UN General Assembly and Security Council meetings about this referendum. And what's your take on the potential outcomes of this referendum?
Well, as a ex-diplomat, so to speak, I have to base my opinions on what is being said and what is being done. So when you look at the statements coming out of Ankara, Baghdad, Tehran as neighbors, and then from Washington, D.C., as well as other European powers, and then Moscow, this is one thing. We see that the rhetoric is getting hard and hard, although Moscow seems to be the most mild-mannered among these. And I also seem to detect that there is a certain disappointment even in Baghdad when Moscow's reaction is concerned. But the facts on the ground, as we speak today, Iraqi parliament, you know, that empowered the Prime Minister Abadi to take over frontiers of Iraqi Kurdistan region and airports of the region, which Erbil and Süleymaniye, if need be, by military force. And in a second move, the parliament again sort of instructed the Prime Minister to take over the oil fields of Iraqi Kurdistan regions. And among these, first and foremost, of course, Kirkuk oil field, which is the engine of the region. So we have to take this seriously. And then we saw that there was a military maneuver already at the right at the Turkish side of the Habur border gate. The level of activity was increased on that. Following that, the Iraqi Chief of Staff, General Osman Ghanimi, arrived in Ankara. And right after, we saw Iraqi troops in joint military maneuvers, the target of which only can be the takeover by force of Habur border gate. There is talk of also opening a new border gate to the west of Habur, which is a surrealistic target to my mind, because I guess Professor Kayaoğlu also underlined the fact that the Iraqi side of the Turkish border is Iraqi Kurdistan since '91. And even we might say safely that this is controlled by KDP, Habur border gate involved. So this will really flare up the situation if we go towards that direction. But today, Associated Press news agency reported that anonymous Iraqi officials actually confirmed that Iraqi forces intend to establish checkpoints right at the Habur gate. Does that mean that they will try to take over the existing crossing point, or in a very, again, surreal situation, are Iraqi forces poised to establish checkpoints right inside the Turkish border just to control the flow of goods and traffic at that border gate? I do not know. Again, in a new statement by Iran, we understand that Iran not only stopped the shipment of fuel, but also they stopped to deal directly with Iraqi Kurdistan region when it comes to crude oil trade. Then maybe on another positive side of the tally, we can see that just before the referendum, it was either Saturday or Sunday, Iraqi forces concluded a memorandum of understanding with the Peshmerga forces in conducting their operation in Havija region of Kirkuk. And the fifth point of that MOU is interesting to my mind because it accepts the Peshmerga control line. So this is a little bit, not a little bit, but thoroughly conflicting with what the Iraqi parliament instructed the prime minister. But the prime minister seemed to have buried the hatchet with Ankara in other issues. And Ankara also responded, as they say, it takes two to tango, in saying that from now on we will deal directly with Baghdad in all issues concerning Iraqi Kurdistan region. And the other thing is there is now a NOTAM in place, Notice to Airmen, stopping all international air travel inbound and outbound from both Erbil and Süleymaniye international airports. And Ankara followed, actually, Baghdad's steps. So Ankara seemed to be moving along with Baghdad, but not imposing its own embargo, because Habur is still open. And most importantly, the pipeline is important, although the President of the Republic, Mr. Erdogan, said that the valve is in our hands, so we can switch it off at a moment's notice. And even we can starve Iraqi Kurdistan to death if it comes to that. We will have to, again, wait and see for a while whether these measures will be temporary or not. And also, I think the following topic will be President Putin's visit to Ankara.
The next video.
So I'm not going to dwell on that, but as Rosneft became the most important business partner of Iraqi Kurdistan region, all these moving parts are interconnected. We have to bear that in mind too.
So as our previous speaker, Mr. Kayaoğlu, said, most of the reactions that came from President Recep Tayyip Erdogan were taken not diplomatically, but on a personal level. They were taken very personally by the local population in the Iraqi Kurdistan. So how do you think this will translate to the economic relations between the two entities, between Turkey and northern Iraq, the Iraqi Kurdistan? And you've also made some references to the oil trade in the region. So I'm asking my question in light of that, mostly.
I was humbly, let's say, an actor in creating these relations, trade relations, oil trade, and even starting the Turkish Airlines flights to Erbil and Süleymaniye. So I have a personal interest in all these. The point was that these relations were mutually beneficial to both sides, and this is true. Iraqi Kurdistan is the business-friendly gateway to the rest of Iraq, and maybe now, as we set a wall all along the Syrian border, it is also not only a business-friendly gateway to the rest of Iraq, but also it is a gateway for the Turkish economy to Iran and to the rest of the Middle East as well. So we have to take this into consideration, and I understand the Minister of Economy, Mr. Zeybekci, is also of the same opinion, because he said not only once that economic embargo will not be beneficial to Turkey, but if this is a question of national security and if instructed by the Council of Ministers, then he will have to impose those crippling measures. And this is true. The other thing is Kurdistan regional government is the most important partner to US in combating ISIL. And it is also, for Ankara, the most important partner in the region when it comes to counterterrorism operations. For Iran, this is not true. In Iran, right after the referendum, we saw, especially in Sanandaj, elated Kurdish crowd cheering and celebrating the results of the referendum. For Iran, keeping its weight in Baghdad is the most important thing. And the other thing, I know that I'm a little bit digressing from the economic issue, but for Mosul as well, we have to always remember that Iraq has other problems as well. And these are not resolved. And I do not mean only ISIL. The future of Mosul's relations with Baghdad also will be affected by the way Baghdad treats this issue. If Mosul understands that Baghdad's move to a heavy-handed approach with Erbil and Süleymaniye, with the Iraqi Kurdistan region, then it will change course, in my mind, accordingly. And this will not be in the interest of neither Baghdad nor the international community, and not the least also for Ankara.
We'll continue with our next video, but before we do that, thank you very much, Mr. Kayaoğlu, for your comments and for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Ankara yesterday on a one-day working visit to hold talks with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Ankara yesterday to meet with his counterpart President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The two presidents were scheduled to talk about the Astana process on a ceasefire in Syria, the independence referendum held by the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government, and Ankara's purchase of Russian S-400 missile defense systems. Putin's one-day working visit to Ankara came 3 days after the two leaders spoke in a telephone call that included a discussion of the controversial independence referendum in Iraq's autonomous Kurdish region. In the joint press conference after the meeting, Erdogan said both Ankara and Moscow agree that the territorial integrity of Iraq and Syria must be preserved. He added that the recent referendum in Iraq's Kurdish region had no legitimacy and that the regional leaders must be prevented from making bigger mistakes. It's very important that the international community takes a stance supporting Iraqi territorial integrity and political unity, Erdogan said. The Kremlin, however, has not explicitly condemned the referendum and instead has emphasized the importance of maintaining Iraq's territorial integrity. The two leaders agreed to closely cooperate on ending Syria's 6-year-old civil war. Putin said that Moscow and Ankara will work to deepen coordination on ending the war, adding that the necessary conditions now existed for the conflict to end. Although Moscow and Ankara support different sides in Syria's ongoing civil war, Russia, Turkey and Iran agreed earlier this month to create a de-escalation zone in Idlib, an area under the control of opposition forces in northern regions. Erdogan said that they agreed to pursue more intensely the creation of a de-escalation zone in Idlib. The two presidents also commented on the economic affairs between Russia and Turkey, focusing on the Turk Stream gas pipeline project from Russia to Turkey and the Akkuyu nuclear power plant being built in Turkey jointly with Russia. We place great importance on the realization of these projects swiftly, Erdogan said. Erdogan also added that the two states aim to increase their trade turnover to $100 billion a year. Putin said that Russia has already lifted most of its restrictions on Turkish agricultural products, resulting in a 58.7% surge in imports of Turkish fruits, vegetables and other farm products in the first half of 2017. Putin also added that the number of Russians going on vacations in Turkey has increased 11-fold so far this year, totaling 2.5 million people. The two leaders didn't mention the deal which was announced earlier this month for Turkey to buy Russia's advanced air defense missile system, the S-400.
Welcome back, Mr. Selcen. So as we've just heard, one of the main items in the agenda of the meeting between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was the economic relations between the two countries. And the focus was on the Turk Stream project, the Akkuyu nuclear power plant project, and also the trade relations between the two countries. So how do you evaluate the meeting in terms of this item in the agenda?
Again, basing my comments on what is being said and what is being done, the press conference was brief and no questions were taken. We understand that this is a visit which is kind of, it's a work in progress, so to speak. So we did not arrive to the conclusion point of this bilateral negotiations, but there is still work in progress to be done on either side, in Russia and in Turkey. The other thing is probably as a disappointment to Ankara side, the focal points were the bilateral issues and cooperation in Syria, but not Iraq or not the Iraqi Kurdistan referendum. This being said, to come back to your question, when you look at the tally of these relations, we see that on the Turkish side, we gained the green light to start the Euphrates Shield operation in Syria. This is the biggest plus, let's say, on our side. The other thing is tourism and the slight increase in the volume of trade, but not so big to push it back to the previous ante-crisis levels. But on the Russian side, the Akkuyu nuclear plant will link Turkey to Rosatom for decades to come. So this is a big gain for Moscow. Turkish Stream, again, is again more for Moscow, because this will be an alternative route for Russian gas to reach European Union, not only Turkey. S-400s, again, is a big win for Putin, because at the end of the day, we talk about two batteries which are going to create two bubbles of defense. We are not talking about a national missile defense system, but two bubbles in where they are going to be positioned. There is no technology transfer, if we have to believe what is being said by the Russian officials. And I understand there is no production neither on Turkish soil, because the technology level is not appropriate. And we will see when these are going to be delivered, because the hands of the factory building these systems are full. So more or less this is work on progress, and the wins are mostly on the Russian side. On the political side, the S-400s is a thorny issue for a NATO member like Turkey. When it comes to Syria, yes, through the Astana process, Turkey now will be able to position probably around 500 troops in Idlib, and it will be probably in the interest of Ankara to stop those Salafi terrorists inside the Syrian border. But it is a risky move. But on the other hand, to come back to my previous point in the earlier section of your program, Rosneft is the biggest partner of the Kurdistan regional government, and the deals it made with Kurdistan regional government involves Turkey as well, as the oil pipeline goes through Turkey, and the new gas pipeline to be built will arrive in Turkey, and the client probably will be Turkey again. So I do not see how there will be an increased cooperation with Moscow when it comes to Iraqi Kurdistan region, as it is going to jeopardize Moscow's interests in Kurdistan region.
Actually, my next question was going to be about the S-400 missile systems deal between Russia and Turkey, although you've briefly made some references to that in your response. So let me reformulate the question like this. When it comes to the S-400 missile systems deal between the two countries, it looks as if Turkey is the more eager side, while the Russian side is playing it more cautiously and more quietly. First of all, would you agree with this kind of a statement? And secondly, if yes, why do you think is the situation this way?
At the end of the day, this is a product. It's a Russian product, and Russia may be eager to sell it. And they have no difficulty actually in selling this product. The problem for Russia might be the transfer of this knowledge and technology to a NATO member country. This is a sensitive issue for the Russian side. And for the Turkish side, the most important thing, as this was the reason cited to ditch the deal, the earlier deal with the Chinese, the technology transfer. When it comes from a purely defense angle, it is not going to help really the national defense of Turkey, because it's not going to work with NATO radars and within the NATO system. So it's going to be an awkward situation for Turkey, but it might have some help, let's say, maybe on the Syrian border, on the Syrian border, and I have difficulty really to grasp which kind of threat perception is currently being discussed in Ankara. So, which kind of threat is going to be stopped by just positioning two S-400s batteries? If the reason was not the technology transfer, I can hardly fathom really the mentality behind buying these systems. And last but not the least, there will be no production in Turkey as far as I can understand, and maybe that explains the quite subdued approach of Moscow. And it might be also the fact that the priority for Moscow is to complete the Turkish stream and to put into place at least the first part of the Akkuyu nuclear power plant, and then to proceed in selling, procuring these S-400 systems to Turkey, and see what happens between now and then.
Thank you very much, Mr. Selcen, for your comments on both topics.
Thank you.
Prominent journalist Kadri Gürsel was released from pre-trial detention on Monday after the third hearing of the Cumhuriyet trial.
The third hearing in the Cumhuriyet trial was held on Monday, September 25th, before the Istanbul 27th Heavy Penal Court in the Çağlayan courthouse. The court ruled the release of Cumhuriyet journalist Kadri Gürsel, while the remaining 5 defendants, President of Cumhuriyet Daily's Executive Board, Attorney Akın Atalay, Cumhuriyet Foundation Management Board Member, Attorney Bülent Utku, Editor-in-Chief Murat Sabuncu, Correspondent Ahmet Şık, and Twitter user Ahmet Kemal Aydoğdu remained in pre-trial detention. Gürsel was greeted by his wife, Nazire Kalkan Gürsel, relatives, friends, and MPs from the main opposition, Republican People's Party. Each hearing of the Cumhuriyet case was historic, because it showed how journalism could be defended and how empty the accusations were. Every journalist wants to write, as long as the conditions allow them. I will of course continue to write, Gürsel told reporters. 17 Cumhuriyet staff are accused on terrorism charges, with allegations of links to the PKK, the Revolutionary People's Liberation Party Front, and the Fethullahist terrorist organization, FETÖ. The next hearing of the case will be held on October 31st. Kadri Gürsel spoke to Medyascope TV's daily Turkish language news show the day after his release.
Onlara anlatan ve dolayısıyla bu eylemi kınayan
It's great to reunite with one's family, spouse, children and friends. But on the other end, there is nothing to celebrate, because there is no real justice manifested here. We were put in jail because of political reasons and also released for the same reasons. That's why we have to keep our cool. I already knew how important and vital the concept of solidarity is. That's why for more than 10 years I was involved in press freedom activism. For the past few years, I was the Turkish National Committee Chair of the International Press Institute IPI, which is based in Vienna. I think the only legitimate sort of activism a journalist can be involved in is press freedom activism. I was in pre-trial detention for nearly 10 months. Before me, they released 7 of our friends who had been in detention for 9 months. And they kept me in for another 2 months before releasing me. During the process, all of us grasped once more how important it is for international organizations, national NGOs, and professional associations to work together and show solidarity with one another.
AKP's candidate Mevlut Uysal was elected as the new mayor of Istanbul following the resignation of Kadir Topbaş.
Istanbul Mayor Kadir Topbaş announced last Friday that he was stepping down from his post, which he had held since 2003. Before entering office as mayor, Topbaş worked as an architect for many years. In a press meeting, Topbaş said, "I have resigned, but I'm not leaving my party." The resignation came among disputes in the municipality administration concerning zoning amendments and their potential damage on the municipal council. Topbaş said he was not offended by the disputes and added that he welcomed criticism, although he would not tolerate not being taken seriously. "We tried not to make mistakes. Mistakes and betrayal should not be confused. Those who betray are never forgiven, but I'm proud," he said. "We should stand by our President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as 80 million people. Thank you to the people of Istanbul and also to the President, the Prime Minister and the ministers," he said. Topbaş was replaced by Justice and Development Party's mayoral candidate Mevlut Uysal, who was elected by the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipal Council. The council could not announce a winner after the first and second round of voting, as no candidate received the necessary support of 2/3. In the final round of the election, Uysal received 179 out of 309 votes, while his rival and main opposition Republican People's Party candidate Ekrem İmamoğlu received a total of 125 votes. The newly elected mayor vowed to further develop the city and thanked President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for his previous services as the Istanbul mayor, which broke ground in the municipal world. A lawyer by training, Mevlut Uysal is the AKP's former deputy chair responsible for legal affairs. He started his political career in 2001, when the AKP was first founded, and served as the mayor of Başakşehir district in Istanbul for 8 years. Uysal was a defense attorney in the controversial Madımak trial following the 1993 Islamist arson attack against Turkish secular intellectuals, during which 33 were killed.
Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Şimşek announced Turkey's medium-term economic program on Wednesday.
Turkey's medium-term economic program, covering the period between 2018 and 2020, was announced on Wednesday with ambitious targets for several macroeconomic indicators. According to the announcement made by the Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Şimşek, Finance Minister Naci Ağbal and Development Minister Lütfi Elvan, Turkey foresees 5.5% economic growth and 9.5% inflation this year. The program targets a 5.5% growth rate for the 2018-2020 period and GDP per capita to raise from $11,000 to $13,000 in the upcoming 2 years. The ministers said that Turkey's main objective is to catch balanced, sustainable and inclusive growth and improve the quality of human sources and the labor force. The government forecasted that the unemployment rate would be less than 10% at the end of 2019. The unemployment rate surged to 13% at the beginning of this month. The Deputy Prime Minister also announced that they aim to lower the current account deficit to GDP ratio to below 4% by 2020, with a 4.6% projection for the end of 2017. To improve the investment environment is our top priority to finance the country's current account deficit, said Şimşek.
Now let's have a look at what's on in Istanbul this weekend.
Norwegian trip-hop band Flank will be on İKSV Salon stage tonight. They came into our lives in early 2000s after a long break, and they will celebrate their new album, Chemistry and Math, which was released today. It features renditions of New Order's Blue Monday, which was almost better liked than the original, and Radiohead's Karma Police. They will take Salon stage with their old songs and new songs alike. Future Tellers is going on at Digilog Space Zorlu PSM. The exhibition that consists of thought works by 12 participants stretches over a range of media from drawing, sculpture, code, text to film and mixed media installation. Applications and inventions of new technologies are often derived from science, which reminds us of the relevance of shared beliefs and focused intention in the matter of constructing features. The 13th Film Ekimi Film Festival started yesterday with the screening of Darren Aronofsky's latest film Mother. The festival will be on until the 9th of October in Atlas, Beyoğlu, Rex and Cities Movie Theaters.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.